I think perhaps at the moment the best that can be hoped for is that um, Israel, under American pressure, realizes that actually proceeding with a full-scale military assault again on Gaza is unlikely to achieve the objectives which were not achieved the first time round.
Today we've spoken to Nicholas Hopton. He's the Director General of the Middle East Association and the former British Ambassador to Libya. And we've talked about the news this week that the ceasefire deal between Israel and Gaza has broken down after Israel launched strikes on Gaza this week. Nicholas Hopton, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
Sadly, you're joining us under a slight cloud after the ceasefire between Israel and Gaza broke yesterday after almost 2 months when Israel resumed strikes over Gaza, and the Gaza Health Ministry saying that at least 400 people were killed in these strikes. Can you just tell us exactly sort of what's happened over the last 48 hours and what led us up to this moment?
Yes, thanks very much, Fergus. I think you have to go back slightly further, actually, to the beginning of the ceasefire, which was the 19th of January. Not a coincidence, that was the day before President Trump was inaugurated as president. The ceasefire was always fragile right from the beginning and designed in 3 phases. And the first phase was scheduled to come to an end at the end of February. In fact, negotiations should have started on the second phase well before that. Now, the ceasefire in its first phase did function in as much as Israeli hostages were released by Hamas, and not all of them by any means, but 35 or so Israeli hostages were released in exchange for Palestinian being detained in Israeli prisons were released as well. And the ceasefire negotiations for the second phase didn't start as they should have done, unfortunately, although humanitarian aid was flowing into Gaza. And then the Israelis, for their part, seemed reluctant to engage in negotiating the second phase of the ceasefire, which would have led to more of the hostages being released and more Palestinian prisoners being released. The Israeli withdrawal militarily from the Philadelphia corridor on the border with Egypt, a very important piece of land, and further discussions about making a stable and long-term peace settlement. Now, the gateposts were effectively moved by both sides in this period, and initially 2 weeks ago, on the 2nd of March, Israel suspended humanitarian aid into Gaza. Now, that was initially a break with the ceasefire agreement, and was met with condemnation internationally. The Hamas side were also effectively in breach of the ceasefire, delaying the release of hostages, obviously treating appallingly the hostages they'd held, which caused huge outrage, not just in Israel, but globally, seeing the state hostages were being handed over in. So there was never really any trust in this ceasefire agreement, and it was always very fragile. And what's happened in the last few days, to come to your direct question, Fergus, is that the American special envoy of the president, Steve Witkoff, who incidentally, and it's an important point, is also, of course, playing a role in the Ukraine-Russia negotiations. But Steve Witkoff presented a compromise bridging agreement, as he put it, by which the ceasefire would be extended, and it would lead to a continued period of negotiations on what happens next until after Passover, which is the 19th of April, after Ramadan, of course, as well, which ends at the end of this month. And that would create space for the negotiations to continue. And in the meantime, the further Israeli hostages should be released by Hamas, particularly US-Israeli dual nationals. And this was rejected by Hamas, and on the grounds that it was moving the terms of the initial ceasefire agreement. However, they came up with their own proposals, which were deemed unworkable by both the Israelis and the Americans. So that was the situation until very recently. And although there has been violence continuing in Gaza and the West Bank throughout this ceasefire period, it really erupted in the last 48 hours. And the media reports of, as you say, at least 400 people, of which it is said half of them are women and children, have been killed in this short space of time from Israeli airstrikes. So far, without a direct Hamas response, but clearly this is an escalation in the breakdown, if you like, of the ceasefire. I don't think you can say that all hope is yet dead, but this is a very, very delicate moment and clearly very disturbing to see what's been going on in Gaza.
You wrote back at the start of February, just after the ceasefire was announced, that it was exactly that. It was a ceasefire, not an end to the war. So I can't imagine, are you particularly surprised by what's happened this week?
I don't think many people, sadly, will be surprised by the escalation in violence and the killing. The lack of trust between the parties is obviously fundamental to that. Hamas being a terrorist organization, having committed appalling atrocities on the 7th of October 2023, puts them beyond the pale in the eyes of many, particularly, of course, the Israeli government. And this is a very difficult situation to see how it can be resolved in a sustainable long-term way. I think perhaps at the moment the best that can be hoped for is that Israel, under American pressure, realizes that actually proceeding with a full-scale military assault again on Gaza is unlikely to achieve the objectives which were not achieved the first time round. The full release of hostages and elimination of Hamas, for example, neither of which seem likely. They weren't achieved in the 15 months of conflict before. And in fact, by escalating the attacks and the number of civilian deaths in Palestine, probably just makes far more risk the lives of the hostages still being held by Hamas.
Well, I was going to ask, do you think it is likely that Israel won't launch another full-scale invasion? I think Benjamin Netanyahu did an address on Tuesday night. He said that this was sort of only the beginning and that negotiations will only continue from here under fire.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, is always strong on rhetoric. And I think it is very worrying if that is the direction of travel. Certainly, he's been under pressure domestically from the more hardline members of his government, but also other groups, settler groups who he relies on for their political support. He's been under pressure to abandon the ceasefire from the word go. It was significant, I think, that those more extreme elements of his political support seemed to rally to him, and indeed some coming back, I think, into his government over the last day. So maybe we are now into a new phase where the Israeli government, at least in their own minds, has abandoned the ceasefire agreed on the 19th of January and is looking for something completely different. How, though, the question remains, how that will ensure the safe return of the remaining hostages is far from clear.
Because it seems to me, at least, I think there are 59 hostages still to be returned, but the ones that have been returned so far have been done so through diplomacy.
Well, I think that you put your finger on it there, Fergus. The outcome, if it is to be a sustainable outcome to this conflict, as in any conflict, essentially, if it's going to be sustainable, needs to be through diplomacy rather than conflict. Now, I think, given the history, given the proximity of the various communities living in Israel and in the countries around it, this needs to be done in conjunction with the neighbours as well. And I think it's very important, although the eyes of the world are largely on what the Prime Minister of Israel and the White House have been saying about developments in Israel, it's very important also to take full account of what the Arab countries have been doing and saying about how this situation can be resolved peacefully for the long term. And there have been initiatives led by Egypt and the Gulf countries, particularly, and Jordan, who are, both Egypt and Jordan, of course, have got particular relationships with Israel. But these initiatives led to a conference on the 4th of March, top level, which agreed among the Arab states a sustainable, as they put it, sustainable plan for the peaceful reconstruction of Gaza, which would involve an injection of a large amount, probably of Gulf money, but with the support of the Arab nations. So they have a plan on the table, which is different, of course, from the situation described by President Trump earlier of creating, as he put it, a Riviera on the Mediterranean, which never really looked like a viable plan. Of course, it would have been against international law to forcibly displace the Palestinians from Gaza. And since then, of course, President Trump has rowed back on that and said, no, nobody's talking about removing the Palestinians from their land. So it's not very clear what the White House long-term plan would be. I think at the moment, the most viable, credible ideas are coming from the Arab states, and they have been supported by European countries, including the United Kingdom, as worth exploring and developing. The element of the jigsaw puzzle which is missing, of course, is perhaps the most difficult, which is how do you secure the territory of Gaza? What security forces should be on the ground, whether peacekeepers or other forces? Obviously, Hamas will no longer, whether under the Arab plan or any other plan, be allowed to play a leading role in Gaza. And the Israeli forces occupying that territory would not be acceptable to the Arabs, who are very clear and now united perhaps in a new way, calling for a sovereign independent state for Palestine. And I think that piece of the jigsaw puzzle is going to be essential, because you can't have a development reconstruction in Gaza without security. And I think the Arab plan is contingent on that. So that side of things also needs watching, and it's notable that in the last in the last 24 hours, in reaction to the uptick in Israeli strikes and the death of further Palestinians, some Arab leaders, including the Prime Minister of Qatar, who has been playing a pivotal role in the negotiations for the ceasefire, Sheikh Mohammed Al Thani, he has come out very strongly condemning what he would describe as Israel breaking the ceasefire.
That certainly seems to be Hamas's position. I think they said on Tuesday night that the US bears full responsibility for what's happened this week, because we know that Trump gave the sort of go-ahead to the strikes by Israel. We haven't heard much from him. You talked about a development structure there. Is it also true that there can be no development structure without support from the US?
I think so. I don't think there can be progress essentially without the support from the United States. And so far, what we've seen has been a mixed bag, really. Certainly, President Trump and President Biden contributed in a very significant way to making the 19 January ceasefire agreement possible. It wouldn't have happened without. President Trump supporters would say, of course, he was the main architect. And as I say, it was agreed so that it came into force immediately before his inauguration. He had made clear repeatedly, and still does, that the US does not like wars abroad and doesn't want to be involved in them. So if you take that as a starting point, presumably the president's intention is to get to a point where there is peace in the Middle East. And that I think, was why Steve Witkoff was dispatched last week to try and create this bridging proposal to extend the ceasefire, to give space to negotiate further. It is surprising and disappointing if the White House has given a green light to these Israeli strikes, which, while the Israeli authorities are saying they were targeting terrorists and extremists, clearly have killed a very high number of civilians. So I'm not sure how the White House calculates that this will lead to an extension of the ceasefire negotiations, and then a longer-term sustainable peace agreement and the reconstruction of Gaza, whether as a Riviera or as a viable independent sovereign state. I suspect there's something to be learned from what is happening in parallel in US engagement on Ukraine and Russia. And as I said, the envoy to both these areas of conflict is the same man, a very trusted ally of Donald Trump, Steve Witkoff.
Well, just to finish, you spoke about the Arab plan that was approved by sort of European leaders as well earlier this month. Do you think that that is realistic, and can you see that happening in the future?
I think in some ways it's a very positive thing. In other ways, it's deeply flawed. Um, the positives are that the Arab countries have come together in a more united way than previously in support of an independent Palestinian state. Some countries which were coy about voicing that in clear terms before, such as Saudi Arabia, have got off the fence and are playing a leading role in that. I think it's also very important that the Arab countries seem ready to put their money where their mouth is. And also to contemplate, in certain circumstances, a different kind of relationship with Israel, and peace and stability across the whole neighborhood in a new way, so something we haven't seen for over a century, and possibly ever. So I think those are positive elements. As I said earlier, the flaw is that the security element. How do you make sure that it is safe to rebuild Gaza? Why would countries want to put in tens of billions of pounds of reconstruction aid without guarantees that it won't be bombed again the day after by Israel? Um, that is the flaw, or if not a flaw, that is the weakness which needs addressing if an outcome that is sustainable is to be reached.